Hi, my name is Maddie from Waging Peace. We're a charity, our charity name is Article 1, I should say, that actually supports Sudanese refugees exclusively. So very much interested to hear Zaher's thoughts on some of the challenges he's faced. Certainly everything that's been said today echoes what we've discovered over 14 years of working with this community. I just wondered if you could comment a bit more on some of the issues of systematic discrimination that people, Darfuris, face in Khartoum, because as you rightly pointed out, and it's an issue that's very topical at the moment, in the UK at least, that they are looking at revising the country guidance case that has protected thousands of non-Arab Darfuris in Britain for years and years. They're now looking at revising that to suggest that Khartoum is safe. Obviously, the kind of threshold for what systematic discrimination is and what then would have to be persecution is very high. I'm wondering if you felt it did reach that threshold, or if you had examples that were given to you during the course of your research.
Thank you. And maybe one more question here. Yes, the woman in the back.
Okay, thank you very much. And just allow me to say that I'm really glad that this report is going to be published. And did I say my name? Suat Musa, and I am from Al Fashir, from Darfur. I have been here since 2002 in Britain, and I live in Manchester. I've come just purposely to attend this workshop, thanks to my colleague, Dr. Zuhair, invited me. I'm happy that at this time, at this juncture of history, that this report has been or is going to be published, because it's really I can see that is going to be very beneficial for the Darfuri people, not for Darfuri only, but all the refugees or asylum seekers or migration. And but my main concern first is about the Brexit and how this report is going to be operationalized within this context of this very complicated process of Brexit. Especially, we know that those Darfuris, they come through Libya, they go into the sea, some of them arrive and the majority die, and then they come through Europe and they go through this, that map that we have seen until they come here. But many of them, they are still stuck in Europe. So that is how, or I hope really that point has been addressed in the report. Going back to the history of immigration in Darfur, when I came here in 2002, we were like 20 families in Manchester, not more than 20 families. And all those families, the majority of them, they came as students, postgraduate students in the late 1980s and early 1920s, and then they just found themselves to stay here, with no other option but to continue. And at that time, even to seek asylum or apply for asylum like something disgraceful. So people don't say that I apply for asylum. Now, seeking asylum has become a tradition or has become cultural and has become, no problem that come and apply for asylum. So that is now, in Manchester, we have more than 3,000 or 4,000 refugees or asylum seekers. More than 50% of them, they are still waiting for their cases to be addressed by the Home Office. Darfur people, for years, even before the colonialism, or the British colonials, they used to go and to migrate to other parts of Sudan, seeking better opportunities of working in the agricultural lands or whatever, just to get money and come back. And then after a while, they just go to Libya when they learned about, better opportunities in Libya, but they never stayed there, they come back. And they have contributed a lot to the development of the economy in Darfur. Those people, especially from those ethnic groups, and especially from Zakawa and from the Four people. These are the ethnic groups that, at the moment, they are the most targeted by, all the problems and atrocities in Sudan. Now, I just leave that at this point, and because since this 2002, now the coming to Europe has not become just a need, but it's become as ambitious. It is an ambition for people now to come here. And that's why they stake their lives to come here. And they keep, moving within Europe because they want to come here. because they feel more safe to come to UK or to, because of their families, it's because they have social safety nets here that they want. So the root cause, when I see this report is about causes and consequences, that means that this report is going to address the causes of the conflict, and these causes of the conflict is there in the country. And the consequences is here. So it is easier to address the consequences than to address the causes. So this report is also funded by the European Union. And here, we know that the European Union have been in a different kind of relationship, cooperation relationship with Sudan and with African countries in the eastern part, the Horn of Africa and North Africa. And recently, the main, because in the past it was about the good governance, that the European Union was, and the members of the European Union, they were interested in having this, good governance in place, so that there is a kind of stability, there is a kind of human rights, all these, ethical things. But since 2014, and because of these political problems that swiped Europe, 2014 it came this Khartoum process. And that Khartoum process, a large part of that, it was meant to consolidate this cooperation with Europe, and especially with regard to migration and with regard to instability in these African countries. Okay. But in 2016, this process, Khartoum process, was consolidated by giving the Khartoum government about 100 million euros, and that government has been one of the root causes of this migration. So the controversy here, how, because I have no idea about what is really in this report, but I am sure that there is something, to address this point in this report about this issue. So how can the European Union want to address the root causes of conflict there and to stop migration, and at the same time consolidate by training and by logistic and by whatever means of capacity building, the government that is really behind all the atrocities, the government whose president is indicted by the International Criminal Court. And that is really, for me, what's really concerned me, is that is there really any opportunity that this report can help or has really showed or addressed that the contribution of the European Union to the state in Sudan is really contributing to more immigration, more instability, and more human rights violation. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. So let's actually start with this question of the Khartoum process, because all of you have touched on it in one way or another. And in particular, the focus on Darfur, Sudan, as a transit country versus a country of origin, and the implications of that in terms of the policies between European governments and the Sudanese government, and you pointing out the failure of that process to really get to the heart of what's driving people out of Sudan. I don't know if Dame Marsden or any of the researchers, maybe Margie or Suzanne, would like to address that specific question that came both from Oliver and also from Sohair. Was that your? Sohad. Suad. Dame Marsden, why don't you go start?
Okay. Well, I'm glad you raised the Khartoum process. I think the two problems are, one, that it's very much focused, as you said, on Sudan as a transit country. Sudan is also, as the report says, a very important producing country of refugees. Of course, it also, like other countries in the Horn of Africa, also receives refugees particularly from South Sudan, fleeing their crisis. So it's a complex picture, but I think the Khartoum process focuses only on on Sudan as a transit route, which has implications then for the way the whole sort of policy has been framed, which is based on the premise that it's possible to address the migration issue by working in partnership with the government of Sudan to fight smuggling and trafficking networks. So the assumption is that the problem is the trafficking and smuggling networks, not the policies of the government itself. So much of the focus for the European Union has been on supporting stronger border controls, doing some police training, I think under some quite tight conditions, but nevertheless training police. This is through the regional Better Border Management Programme, which I think is funded to about the tune of 40 million euros, but that's for the whole Horn of Africa region. And also, there's also a plan apparently to set up a regional operations centre in Khartoum for sharing police intelligence. So there are a lot of issues that arise out of all this, particularly an increasing number of reports showing that government of Sudan officials are themselves complicit in trafficking and smuggling, and of course the policies of the government more broadly in relation to counterinsurgency operations, targeting civilian populations in some cases in the conflict zones. So the other issue that has been very controversial is the fact that since the European Union entered into this Khartoum process, the government of Sudan decided to assign the main responsibility for combating irregular migration and border control to the Rapid Support Forces, which is a government paramilitary force initially mainly composed of the Janjaweed, although now they've brought in a number of other tribes. But this forces itself has been allegedly linked to large-scale human rights abuses. And indeed, a report that's just been published by the Klingendal Institute shows that the Rapid Support Forces itself actually involved in smuggling and trafficking. Now, the European Union has strenuously and repeatedly denied giving any financial support to the Rapid Support Force. But an indirect consequence, in a way, of the European approach has been to empower the Rapid Support Force in playing this border management role. And it's been, I think, rather embarrassing for the European Union that the leader of the Rapid Support Force, whose name is Hemeti, has frequently threatened to stop arresting migrants en route to Europe and to turn on the tap, as he puts it, of migration if the Rapid Support Force doesn't get rewarded by the European Union. So that is obviously a very problematic aspect of all this. There's also concern as to whether any of the information or equipment that might be provided to the Sudanese police could be diverted to other security agencies within the government. And I think particularly amongst NGOs, there's a widespread feeling that the European Union and its member states need to be more transparent and accountable in terms of what exactly they're funding by way of programmes under the Khartoum process and through which channels.
Thank you for that. Maybe then to get to this question of risk and risk calculation, something that you posed, Oliver, and maybe turning first to Zuhair on this. Our colleague here, Suhad, described a situation that that migration for many people, in particular young people, is not only a need, it's an ambition. And that's something I think that resonates with your research, and in particular in Somalia. So maybe if you could just, knowing what you know in the communities that you work with here, what is that risk calculation? What makes people leave a life that they know and risk everything to come to a life that doesn't sound all that great where they end up?
Thank you. Actually, most of the people who came here, they know exactly the risk, and they are quite aware about it. And when you ask them, as have been quoted in this report, they would say if they stay in Sudan, they are going to die slowly. But if they make it through the Mediterranean, there is two options, either to die or to get across the Mediterranean. So it's better to take the two options than to stay for one option that for them is given. And there is no hope in any kind of that the situation is getting better soon, as long as al-Bashir and his group is there. So that's one thing. The other thing is, as Suad has mentioned, it has become a kind of ambition to come here, because the youngest who came here, they just send their pictures and some photos to the their friends over there or their mates at the village to tell them that the life here is very nice. Although sometimes they have faced a lot of difficulties, but they don't talk about that. They only talk about the rose face of this life. So they send pictures and photos telling people life here is very nice, clean. We have this accommodation, and they give the kind of accommodation they are in. We receive some assistance, and what makes them to be trusted is a part of this, small part of this kind of assistance that they receive, they send it back to family. So the people there can see their families getting better off after they came here, especially the people who have arrived here and have got the refugee status, and then they were able to go to work. So if you are not working, still you can send some of this assistance to your family. If you get a job and work, although it is a very marginal job and with low income, but still to transfer 50 pounds or 100 pounds to Sudan, it makes a big difference. So people will see that the families of the people who are already here is getting better off and their life is changing. So why not they come and change the life of themselves and the life of their families? So that's why it has become a kind of ambitious, and it has become, the immigration itself has become a means of livelihood. So people can very reluctantly put this aside unless they have something that tangible and realistic can replace this, but otherwise they will continue to come. Yeah.
Margie, did you have anything? What does that risk calculation look like to you?
Yeah. Yes, I wanted to respond to, I think, Oliver's question about are there any similarities here to, I think it was the Somali population that you'd mentioned, where maybe one of the reasons they weren't telling their families they were leaving was all tied up with the whole ransom issue. And we didn't find evidence of that in Sudan. So, there was two cases, really. There was definitely many examples of people leaving without telling their families, and it was because they felt their families might discourage them from leaving, but that was principally because of the very high risks of travelling to Europe. And almost everybody that we met knows somebody or knows a family that's lost a family member on the journey. So that was usually the reason for not mentioning to families why they were going to leave, because they thought they would be discouraged or stopped because of the risk of dying. But it was that rather than ransom issues. But then there was also another group where the families were actually encouraging their, usually the young men, sons, and as Suzanne mentioned, sometimes these are minors, to leave because of what had happened to them in Sudan and because they really genuinely feared for their safety. And so you also had examples where family members were clubbing together to raise at least initial sums of money so that their relative could leave, and that was because that person faced huge threats, and sometimes then that was a threat to the entire family. So they were actually encouraging their family member to go. And just very quickly, I wanted to add one other thing, which is I think one of the things we try and highlight in this research that came through is how this migration to Europe is evidence of changing Sudanese society. And so the very fact that young men are leaving Sudan without their families' blessings is unthinkable a generation ago. And it's evidence of a lot of different changes. One of the other changes I think to highlight is that young people, we've heard this a number of times, they're much less tolerant of some of the examples of discrimination that their parents might have experienced. These are young people who are able to access information about life in the rest of the world, who now the language, the lexicon of rights, if you like, is part of their daily language. And So they're not prepared to put up with some of the hardships and the discrimination that their parents might have faced.
Thank you, Margie. Suzanne, maybe to ask you about the waging peace question on systematic discrimination and the thresholds for that discrimination. Did you find that that discrimination had reached those thresholds?
Well, certainly we found evidence of, well, not only discrimination, but more than that, persecution, I think, in Khartoum. Certainly students would talk of kind of repeated arrests, beatings, torture sometimes. And of course, on top of that, faced kind of persistent discrimination in finding employment. We spoke to many students, and this was both in Darfur and in Khartoum, who had tried for years and years and years to get a job, and in the end, just on top of everything else, that was a big contributing factor. But it wasn't only students. I mean, we also talked to people. I mean, quite often. Darfuris would travel to Khartoum before even going to Libya or Europe, and then found that they faced the same amount of kind of harassment that they faced. Well, maybe not exactly the same, but they faced similar kind of harassment, arrests that they would have faced in Darfur. So I mean, certainly you have that element also in Khartoum. Also businessmen who find it difficult, to have their shops attacked and to have, difficulties in operating basically. So definitely, there's plenty of evidence of that happening in Khartoum.
Great, thank you. We have one question over.
I just wanted to say, in South Sudan, there's an enormous, the great network of Darfuris as businessmen throughout South Sudan. I mean, what about the commercial community throughout? I mean, and I think another thing is people go where there are possibilities. I mean, our generation in Sudan all went to Saudi Arabia, to the Gulf, to everywhere to get jobs anywhere that they could because there were the economic possibilities.
Do you want to comment on the economic possibilities as the driver of current migration, even to South Sudan?
Definitely. I mean, that several people that we spoke to said, again, I mean, this would maybe an initial thing that people would try, go to South Sudan, find some work, trade, whatever. And, in some cases that actually gave them the money to then move on to Europe. But also, but more importantly, I mean, when the conflict broke out in South Sudan, that became much more difficult. To use trade in South Sudan as a basis for livelihood. The Gulf also, I mean, maybe Zuhair can talk about this more. It also has become more difficult for Darfuris to find work. I mean, first of all, because you need an exit visa, and I mean, it's and you need a job, and for many Darfuris, this is very difficult.
Zuhair, anything to comment on that?
Yeah, I just comment on the issue of migration to Gulf has become to an end because situation in Gulf and in Saudi Arabia in particular, because most of the Sudanese go to Saudi Arabia, and that is the big market for the Sudanese. Now the Saudi Arabia have this new policy of Sudanization. That means to give the top jobs and the mid-career jobs to Saudi themselves. So they want to encourage the Saudi to work instead of the Sudanese. And not only that, also the government somehow has kind of relationship with the Gulf governments, and that discourage employment of the Darfurians at top level of advisory jobs and management jobs as well. So that's why the Darfurians feel themselves blocked there, and they have to find another way to go somewhere else. So that's kind.
Okay, thank you. We're coming to the end of the discussion, but I just wanted to put to the panel one last question, and this gets to Suhad's point, the last point I think you were making. And I'm just going to repeat what I thought was your question. How can the EU address its own causes and consequences of its own migration policies, and in particular when it's dealing with a government that's behind a lot of the push factors, behind a lot of the atrocities that we're talking about here, behind a lot of that trauma. I don't know if we want to do sort of one last pass through the panel to see what you thought of that comment from Suhad. Please, Margie.
Yeah, thank you. I think that what is clearly driving a lot of the policies with the EU at the moment is this overriding desire to curb migration. And I think that means that a lot of decisions are being made that are not evidence-based. The fact that this report is the first time that we've really looked at Sudan as a country of origin and have really documented in great detail who's leaving, why they're leaving. This is an opportunity to actually try and switch that policy dialogue to make it evidence-based and to actually address what is happening rather than being driven by this overriding kind of political desire to curb migration, which is affecting everything. It's affecting whether migrants are being given assistance in Calais, whether they're being allowed to cross into France, how European governments are engaging with the Sudanese government. And that's why I would just come back to, this is one final last point I would like to make, is to really, really encourage the rights to be at the centre of the dialogue, to human rights to be absolutely at the centre of the dialogue between European governments and the government of Sudan. And that would be a massive turnaround in how things are being done at the moment.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Yes, I mean, similar comments really. I mean, just clear that, the Khartoum process is not addressing the causes of forced migration from Sudan. Strategies of kind of deterrence in Europe. I mean, I just want to come back to the kind of humanitarian crises in places like Calais and Brussels. I mean, this is just really, really shocking to see this in Europe. I mean, it's even worse than, what, we've seen in Sudan. But and it's clear that the restriction of assistance is being used as a form of deterrence. Now, what's even worse is that for Darfuris, that's not even a deterrent, because even living on the street in Calais is better than being in Darfur. So, I mean, this is how they explained it to us. So it's just, continue to gather evidence of what these policies are actually doing and what they're not doing.
Suhair?
I think with regard to the European policy, it was encouraged by two elements. One element is an internal, whereby the European governments prepare to follow the policy of borders control. That is an easy and for the short run, and they have been pressed by the anti-migration parties for the internal politics here in Europe. That's why they haven't took the option of the long-term solution. So instead, they took the short-term solution, and they go for the controlling. At the same time, for the government of the Sudan, they find it easier to take this example of the European Union. It brings them money. It doesn't make them to do anything other than moving some forces to the borders and do this. Because the other option to address the root causes is going to criminalize the government itself. And the government is not in a position to criminalize itself or to address the root causes. So they just pick up this easy option provided to them by the European Union. That's it.
Dave Marston, last word.
Well, thank you. I think one of the most striking conclusions of the report for me is the fact that it emphasises that the continuing flow of Darfuris trying to migrate to Europe is an indicator of the ongoing humanitarian crisis, and that this is contrary to the narrative that the Darfur conflict is over and that stability is being restored. So I think it's important because this statement doesn't come from members of the Sudanese opposition or from human rights activists. It comes from an academic study commissioned by the European Commission. So, I mean, I think this does underline the fact that it is premature to be trying to move ahead so rapidly with removing UNAMID and sort of talking of normalising relations, that until there is much more progress on achieving a comprehensive political solution, and that this is, in my view, where the focus of the EU's efforts ought to be to a much greater extent than it currently is.
Okay. A firm set of recommendations for the EU from the panel. Thanks, panel, for all of your insights, and thank you for the report, which, as I said, is chock full of very interesting and good detail, so please pick it up outside. We have a limited number of copies, or online where you can download it. Thanks to all of you here in the audience and those who have joined us online for your attention, for your good questions. And the panelists will be here afterwards to have a bit of a chat if you'd like to stay. Thanks very much for joining. The video of this will be online in 2 or 3 days. I'm looking at, yes, okay, great. So if you want to access it then to remind yourself of the discussion, you can. Thanks very much, everybody.